Nobody at Ridgemont General ever asked Nurse Elena Cross about the thin white scar that ran along her collarbone, disappearing beneath the collar of her scrubs. Nobody asked why she flinched, just barely, when the trauma bay doors slammed too hard, or why her eyes swept every room the second she entered it, cataloging exits before she even looked at a chart. To the staff she was simply Elena, quiet, competent, first to volunteer for the overnight shift nobody wanted, last to complain when they are filled with the screaming chaos of a Friday night pileup. She kept to herself. She ate lunch alone. She was, by every outward measure, unremarkable. That was exactly how she needed it to look. What none of them knew, what she had spent 3 years and a small fortune in forged paperwork making sure they would never know, was that Elena Cross did not exist. Not really. The woman standing at bed 6, gently coaxing a frightened 8-year-old through a splinter removal, had once gone by a different name entirely, a name spoken only inside secure briefing rooms and never written on any document that could be traced. She had spent 6 years as a combat medic attached to one of the most classified units in the United States Navy, the kind of unit that didn't appear in press releases, the kind whose casualties were quietly folded into other statistics so no one would ask questions. She had pulled men out of collapsed buildings while bullets stitched the air above her head. She had performed field amputations by flashlight in the back of moving vehicles. She had learned, in the worst classrooms on Earth, exactly how much pain a human body could survive and exactly how to make sure it did. Now she was undercover in a hospital, because 3 months earlier, patients on this exact ward had begun disappearing from their beds, quietly, without paperwork, without explanation, and a trail of falsified transfer records had led federal investigators to suspect that someone inside Ridgemont General was running an organ trafficking pipeline dressed up as routine transfers to specialty care. Elena's mission was simple on paper and brutal in practice. Blend in, watch everyone, trust no one, and find the rot before more names vanished from the system. She had been undercover for 11 weeks. She had learned the rhythms of the hospital, the routines of the night shift, the small tells of every doctor and administrator who touched a discharge form. She had not yet found her answer. But she had found something else. A group of men who thought the hospital was theirs to terrorize. They called themselves security, though half of them had no real credentials, hired quietly by an administrator named Victor Cade who liked having muscle on hand and never asked what for. They swaggered through the halls like they owned them, mocking nurses, intimidating orderlies, occasionally escorting patients to unmarked vehicles in the loading dock at 3 in the morning. Elena had clocked them in her first week. She had watched, memorized faces, memorized shift patterns, memorized the particular cruelty each one favored. And she had said nothing, done nothing, because a soldier on a mission does not blow her cover for a bruised ego or a shoved orderly. She was patient. She had been trained to be patient in far worse conditions than this. That patience nearly ran out on a Tuesday night when the air doors burst open and Cade himself came storming through, flanked by 4 of his men, boots echoing off the tile like a warning shot. He was furious. Someone had tipped off a state inspector about irregular transfer logs, and in his paranoid fury he had decided the leak had to be someone on staff. His eyes swept the room and landed, for no reason beyond proximity and opportunity, on Elena. "You!" he snapped, closing the distance in 3 long strides, finger jabbing toward her face. "You've been asking questions. Talking to people you shouldn't be talking to." Behind him, his men fanned out, boxing her against the nurse's station, and behind them, the rest of their staff froze. Doctors, techs, a janitor with a mop still in hand, every one of them staring in horrid silence, certain they were about to watch their quiet, gentle colleague get hurt and no one would step in fast enough to stop it. Elena did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood very still, the way a coiled spring stands still, and let Cade's finger hover an inch from her nose while she read him. His stance, his breathing, the tremor of adrenaline in his shoulders, the exact millisecond his weight would shift if he decided to grab her. Every one of his men had already made a fatal miscalculation without knowing it. They had surrounded a woman who had once cleared rooms of armed hostiles for a living, who had disarmed men twice Cade's size in half the time it took him to finish his sentence, and who was currently doing nothing more dangerous than deciding whether this was the moment her cover needed to end. "You don't know who you're talking to," Elena said quietly, and something in her voice, flat, level, utterly without fear, made 2 of the men behind Cade take an involuntary step back. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact stated the way a person states the weather. Cade laughed it off, called her delusional, told his men to grab her and drag her to his office for a conversation. One of them reached for her wrist. That was the mistake. In the space of one breath, the frail, quiet nurse the entire hospital thought they understood vanished, and something else took her place. Something trained across 2 combat theaters. Something that had spent years learning exactly how to end a fight before it started. The man's hand never closed around her wrist. Instead, he found himself on the floor, arm locked at an angle that made him scream, before anyone in the room had even processed movement. Cade stumbled back, mouth open, and the staff who had been staring in horrified silence a heartbeat earlier were now staring in stunned, open-mouthed disbelief, because the woman they thought they knew had just moved like nothing any of them had ever seen outside of a movie screen. "Elena?" the head trauma physician whispered, backing away from the nurse's station. "What? Who are you?" Elena straightened her scrubs, stepped over the man groaning on the floor, and looked directly at Victor Cade with an expression that made him, for the first time in years, genuinely afraid. "My name," she said, "isn't Elena Cross. And you're about to find out exactly who sent me. If this story already has your heart pounding, imagine where it goes next. Hit that subscribe button right now because Chapter 2 is where the mask comes all the way off, and Victor Cade learns exactly what happens when bullies corner the wrong nurse." Silence swallowed the ER. The man Elena had dropped to the floor was still cradling his arm, whimpering, staring up at her like she had grown a second head. Cade's remaining 3 men hesitated, glancing at each other, glancing at their boss, waiting for a signal that didn't come, because Victor Cade had gone very pale and very still, the bravado draining out of him the way it does from every bully the instant they realize the person in front of them was never actually afraid. "That's not possible," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You're a nurse. You've been here for months. I've seen your file." "You've seen a file," Elena said. "That was built to be seen." She reached slowly into the pocket of her scrubs, slow enough that no one mistook the motion for aggression, and produced a slim black case she had kept hidden there since her very first shift, tucked against her hip like a rosary. She flipped it open. Inside was a credential none of them recognized, a seal none of them could name, and a photograph of her own face beside a name that was not Elena Cross. "Lieutenant Commander," she said, watching the words land on Cade like physical blows. "United States Navy. I've been assigned to this hospital for 11 weeks investigating a pattern of missing patients that traces directly back to falsified transfer paperwork. Paperwork with your signature on it, Victor." The color left his face entirely now. Behind him, one of his men, younger, clearly newer to whatever operation Cade was running, took a half step away, as if putting distance between himself and his employer might somehow undo whatever he'd already been part of. The rest of the ER staff stood frozen at the periphery, watching a woman they thought they'd understood completely reveal herself as someone none of them could have imagined. And in that frozen moment, something shifted in the room. Not just fear, but the dawning electric realization that the ground beneath Ridgemont General had just cracked wide open. Cade tried to recover, tried to laugh it off as some kind of stunt, tried to remind his men that badges could be faked, that this was still just a nurse standing alone against 5 of them in a room full of witnesses too frightened to intervene. "Grab her!" he barked again, jaw tight, voice cracking at the edges. "Now!" 2 men lunged this time instead of 1. And this time Elena didn't wait to be touched. What followed lasted less than 8 seconds, though to everyone watching it felt like it unfolded in slow motion, the particular terrible slowness of watching something you cannot look away from. She moved like water finding the fastest path downhill, redirecting the first man's momentum into the second, dropping a third with a strike so precise and so economical that he was on the ground clutching his ribs before he understood he'd been hit at all. She never raised her voice. She never looked rushed. Every motion was the product of thousands of hours of training designed for rooms far more dangerous than a hospital corridor, and by the time the sound of the last body hitting the floor finished echoing off the tile, 3 of Cade's 4 men were down, and the 4th had backed himself against the wall with his hands raised, no longer interested in whatever Cade was paying him. Cade stood alone now, chest heaving, and for the first time, real fear cracked through his composure. "Wait," he said, backing toward the doors. "Wait, we can talk about this." "We're past talking," Elena said, and stepped toward him with the calm, unhurried gait of someone who had chased far more dangerous men through far worse terrain than a hospital hallway. Behind her, sirens were already rising in the distance, a sound she had triggered the instant she'd confirmed his signature on the falsified transfer logs. Sent silently through a device sewn into the lining of her scrubs, a message relayed to a federal task force that had been waiting 3 months for exactly this confirmation. Cade heard the sirens too, and something in his expression broke completely, the last of his bravado collapsing into raw panic. He ran. It didn't matter. Elena had already disabled the loading dock exit an hour earlier as a precaution, the kind of contingency planning that had kept her alive in places far more hostile than a Midwestern hospital, and Cade sprinted directly into a dead end where 2 federal agents were waiting, having entered through the ambulance bay the moment her signal went out. He was on the ground, cuffed, and reciting his rights before he'd even finished processing that his exit was a trap. Back in the ER, the staff who had spent 11 weeks quietly pitying the frail, soft-spoken nurse who never said much and kept to herself were now staring at her with an entirely different kind of expression, something between awe and disbelief, the look people wear when the story they thought they were living turns out to be a completely different story altogether. The trauma physician, still catching his breath, finally managed to speak. "All this time," he said slowly, You were protecting us?" "I was doing my job," Elena said simply, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Ridgemont General, something like real warmth touched her expression. The rest of it, the transfers, the missing patients, that's what the investigation was for. You all just happened to work in the middle of it. Over the following days, the full scope of Cade's operation came to light. Patients selected for their lack of family oversight, records falsified to make disappearances look like routine transfers, a network that had been operating in the shadows of the hospital for over a year before anyone thought to look closely enough. Elena's testimony, backed by the evidence she'd spent 11 weeks quietly gathering, became the backbone of the case that shut the entire operation down and put Cade and his men behind bars for years to come. The nurses she'd worked beside without ever revealing herself sent her flowers, thank you cards, quiet apologies for every small way they'd underestimated her. The extra shifts they hadn't thanked her for, the assumptions they'd made about the quiet woman who kept to herself. Elena didn't stay long after the case closed. Women like her rarely do. There was always another assignment waiting, another place where the quiet ones needed protecting, and nobody would think to look twice at a soft-spoken nurse with careful eyes and a scar she never explained. But before she left, she stopped by the ER one last time, not in scrubs, not undercover, just herself, and told the staff who had once seen her as fragile, once seen her as someone to be pitied rather than feared, the only thing she thought they needed to hear: that the strongest people in any room are rarely the loudest ones, and the next time they meet someone quiet, someone who keeps to themselves, someone the world has taught them to underestimate, they might want to look a little closer, because you never really know who you're standing next to. If this story hit you the way it hit us, don't scroll past without hitting subscribe. This channel is just getting started, and the next story might be even more powerful than this one. Drop a comment telling us what you'd do in Elena's shoes. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next twist, and we'll see you in the next story.